of you who are just now entering the webinar, I'm Jeannie Kitchens with SIU Center for Workforce Development, and we're one of the CTI Credential Engine partners. I do hope that the majority of you have been able to participate with previous webinars and have heard the news that CTI is morphing into the Credential Engine. So you'll see our branding has changed. And what this means is the really good news is that there is officially a non-for-profit formed that will carry on this work. So in essence, this project will not end. So I would like to point that out to those of you who might be going, oh, everything looks different. With me on the webinar representing the Credential Engine team is Bob Sheets and Stuart Sutton. We did a little sound check earlier, but let's just give each of them a chance to say hello, introduce themselves.
You want to go first, Bob?
This is Bob Sheets, and thank you all for participating. I also acknowledge that Steve Crawford, one of my colleagues, is also joining on as a participant.
Oh, great. Hi, Steve. And Stuart?
Yes. Hi, this is Stuart Sutton. I'm with the Dublin Core Metadata Initiative and have been involved with the development of the CTDL, which is Credential Transparency Description Language, which is the schema we are using to describe credentials and related entities around credentials, like a credentialing organization and so forth.
Okay, thank you, Stuart. And Stuart is our metadata and CTDL expert, and he's going to cover some of the presentation today. What we're going to talk about today is, as we're moving along through our process, our co-engineering, design and implementation testing process, we're at a point where we're moving on to kind of the next phase of design. And what we want to talk about specifically today is working with our partners to now begin looking at how you can implement the CTDL, and to begin with that by co-designing what we call guidance roadmaps. And for those of you who have been participating with webinars, you've heard us use that reference many times. And what we're going to talk about today is the both analytical and technical approach that will be necessary to further test out the credential transparency description language in the credential registry from your perspective. And so we're going to talk more about that in this webinar. So what we're going to talk about is a little survey that we've developed that we're going to ask all partners to complete, so we can learn more about your kind of behind the scenes processes and technologies. And then we're going to cover the process that Stuart Sutton will lead with designing guidance roadmaps, and that's combining that analytical and technical approach, next steps, and our timeline for this process. Now, throughout today's webinar, we want everyone to feel free to ask questions and make comments. You could do that in the chat at any time. We'll be keeping a close eye out for that, so we may pause and address them as we go through. We'll try to have time at the end as well for any additional questions that come up. As I had mentioned earlier in the webinar, also, we don't want to turn off your audio unless we get background disruptive noise, and we are recording this, so we want to make sure that others who may want to watch it can hear everything. So feel free. We want this to be as interactive as possible. So before we get into kind of the nuts and bolts of the next phase and how we'd like to proceed with that phase with you and with your input, another reminder of how it works now. So currently, this is our process We have the credential transparency description language. It's the metadata infrastructure. Our first official release of the CTDL went out in November, and what that means is that metadata infrastructure is openly available, and the components of it that are flagged as stable can be used by others. So anyone in the world can use the metadata infrastructure. Now, all of our work is a work in progress. It's all going through a continual feedback loop, and that has not ended. And so the first release is only a first release, so there will be more. And the next release to the CTDL will be in February, and then we'll determine the timing for additional releases after that. And so what we want to do is, through our co-engineering processes, to continue to build on the foundation of the CTDL. For those of you who have selected credentials to include with the project, we're using what we call the CTDL editor. And that editor is used through a largely manual process right now that's helping us learn about credentials and converting those credentials into the CTDL that is then published to the registry, which is still a sandbox. It's still for testing, and then is visible only to you, to the partners, with a login in the WorkIt app, which is a prototype app for just showing, okay, now that we have all this, how can this be translated into consumer information in an app? And partners, of course, essential to this entire process, and we have our continual feedback loop. So we want to, everyone to know that that still is what's happening and how we're working with all of the partners. So as we're progressing through this process, we've released our first, the CTDL. Anyone can see it on our website. We've been continuing to work on the editor and the search, and in tandem with all of that, now we're putting in another component. What we want to do is co-design guidance roadmaps. And so what we're looking for is 6 to 10 partners who are willing to participate with our co-design process and testing implementation of the CTDL to populate the registry directly or via harvesting. So, as I said, in the where we are now, it's largely a very intensive manual process of designing and learning. And what we need to do now is work with some partners to test implementing on your own web technologies, the pushing and pulling into the registry. So I'm going to preface this by saying that we're not saying you have to change current technologies. The cool thing of it is that the implementation testing would be an overlay, and it would be an overlay using existing and open source kinds of technologies with the purpose of using the CTDL, and again, to publish directly to or harvest, for us to harvest from your web presence to populate the registry. The intent is to identify a limited set of credentials and not necessarily every credential offered by the organization. So just as you're already familiar with that and you've selected only a subset, again, for the constraints of the pilot testing team, we would have to limit it, but we want to do it in a fashion so, of course, it's scalable. So the first step that we're asking in this process is not only identifying a small subset of partners who will kind of work side by side with us, but we're asking all partners to complete a short survey. Now, as I've mentioned, we've already been looking at your credentials. We've been doing this really intensive kind of manual process. But now we want to go to the next step in the process and learn more about kind of the technologies that are behind what we see on your web page. So what we see on your webpage doesn't necessarily give us all the information we need. So now we have a short survey. It will be emailed to you in a link directly after the webinar, and it's in the PowerPoint actually. The purpose, as I said, is to gain a deeper understanding of the source sources and formats that are used to provide the public information. And I want to pause there again because we have so many partners that some have been with us for quite a while and some continue to join the partnership and don't have all the background knowledge. And so just to be clear, we're only talking about public information. We're not talking about any kind of personally identifiable information. So this would be the kind of information that's, typically already on a website. So what we want to be able to do is have our contacts, and each one of our partners have identified the credential expert and the technical contacts to just sit down together, because I think that they'd have to finish it together and complete our little survey. It won't take long if you have the right people in the room. And along with sending the link, what we'll include is like a PDF so you could just see the questions. So then you could, make sure you have the right people to answer the questions. And with that survey, you can also indicate your interest in working with us. Now today, as we go through the webinar, if you're like, oh, I want to do that, and you're just, you want to participate and you already know that, you can also let us know in the chat. If you have our contact info handy, you can shoot us an email. But there's also a spot in that survey where you'll say, yes, we want to participate, or yes, we're interested, but we need to get with our leadership, to make sure we're good to go, or we're not interested. But again, regardless, we're asking all of our partners to complete this survey. The survey is going to look at these areas that you see on the slide now. Now, the CTDL actually does even go beyond these areas, but we feel like it's a lot of information, and so we want to start out with what I like to call the expected data for the vast majority of our credentials. And so these are the areas that we'll be asking about, information on, again, the kind of behind the scenes. How do you source the information, and what are the technologies behind the information? From what we can tell, it's just not cut and dry. In particular, many large organizations, say a college or a university, would have a combination of behind the scenes kind of sources and formats that are being used to push that data out. So this gives you a good idea of the areas that it will cover, and these are the kinds of topics. What we'd like to do is convene a group of partners that represent a broad range of scenarios, so we can make sure we're designing a robust system or continuing to design a robust system. We're going to want to look at the types and quantities. Of course, every partner has selected at least one credential, and we know what that credential is, and we know what type it is, but many of you offer many other types, and we want to get a better feel for what that looks like. We want to know more about centralized and decentralized data processes. And so what I mean by that is some organizations may have a very clear centralized process where all information about credentials goes through one technology and one kind of centralized sourcing and vetting of that information. But we also know that many colleges and universities have more of a decentralized, centralized combo system that kind of combines both, that it's not as cut and dry as some other organizations might be. And we want to know if content is being served up on your websites from just static HTML web pages versus dynamic back-end systems. We want to get a flavor of the technology so we can better understand and help our partners, and of course the web formats. Now, looking at your websites, gathering the information, we can see web formats. We can see a lot of things are, static web pages, or they could be possibly dynamic content, but we also see a lot of like PDFs and other formats. So we just like to confirm some of our observations. Here's some screenshots of the survey. It's not very long. It's 9 questions altogether, and it's 2 screens. But I think the important aspect of it is to kind of couple up, so with the people that know the credentials and the people that know the tech can sit together and complete it. As I said, we'll include a PDF as well. So we don't want PDFs necessarily filled in and turned in back to us, but you could use it to gather info and then enter it in the survey as well. So let me pause there and see if anyone has any questions about where we are in the process. Our next step of desiring to co-engineer. Now, Stuart's going to get into the nuts and bolts of that in just a moment, or the survey, and the desire to have all our partners complete the survey, but also identify a subset of partners who could work with us to implement some of the technologies on your own web presence so we can better develop guidance for all of our partners. Questions and comments are welcome. Give everyone a minute here and see if there's anything that comes in the chat. Actually, my name is in the end of the PowerPoint, and when you get your follow-up email, Scarlett will send a follow-up email. It will have our contact information in it, and you could definitely feel free to just directly reply to Scarlett or email me. I would say email is best, just because we're in a lot of meetings, and so it gets hard to catch the phone calls, but we check our email every day. And also, let me just check with Bob and see if he wanted to add anything to the background information I just covered before we move on.
No, Jeannie, I think I just want to reinforce the purpose of the survey is twofold, like Jeannie said. It's to make sure we understand the full range of starting points of all our pilot partners who've been provided excellent input throughout the project, and also then to make sure when we work with 6 to 10 pilot partners, we are capturing a cross-section. So when we test the guidelines with you all, we know we are representing the larger population of pilot partners and all the different variations that Jeannie went through in terms of the survey questions.
Yeah, and so, because there's quite a bit of variation, obviously that we're seeing, the range of a small quantity to a very large quantity of credentials is certainly an example. The many different types of organizations that might specialize in a very specific type of credential or a very broad range of credentials, and those types of credentials, because, the CTDL is designed certainly to support any type of credentials. So we know what kind of current set is available in the United States, but we also want to look for what's emerging. As I said, centralized versus kind of decentralized and combination systems, less complex to more complex sources and ways of making the information available to the public, and the range of unstructured, structured data. And then what we want to be able to do is look at, now that we've created the CTDL, we have this registry available, how can we help the partners directly publish, or how can we harvest the CTDL from their web presence? So this kind of is the segue to the process part. I see another question coming in. Again, I want to make sure we're addressing any issues, concerns, questions that you have. If we sign up for this next step, are we going to be asked to add or change? Stuart's going to talk about that next. Ideally, what we're saying is, no, you won't have to change your back-end technologies. You might find things that you'll want to change over time, but what we're going to do, and Stuart's going to explain this further, is use existing open source tools that will help you kind of overlay or utilize those existing technologies to participate. So that is actually, Gary, thank you, a perfect segue to Stuart. So Stuart, how about if I turn it over to you?
Okay. Let me see if I've got control here. I do. Let me follow on there with Gary for a moment. I think the key for us is that we not ask you to do anything that will in any way upset the apple cart with your current technologies. So none of what we're going to be talking about asks you to change, if we can call it a solution stack, your current solution stack on your website. Not at all. Jeannie talks about it as it's kind of an overlay. There are some technologies that you can, open source technologies, some commercial technologies that you can overlay to accomplish some of this, but that does not mean that you have to change anything underneath. And as you'll see in a few moments, there's no request, probably never will be, that you change the data that you expose. Jean says you may choose to change that later as the CTDL and its use and the credential engine matures. You may see things that your colleagues are exposing that you go, yeah, we want to do that too, we should do that too. But that would be a natural process of your own. So in the beginning, we're dealing with the data you have already, and at best, at most, some addition to your solution stack that as an overlay that allows these processes that finally push out your data as in a CTDL format. Otherwise, no. The key here is to try and keep it very, very simple. What you will also see is some of these solutions are massively simple. And I'll talk a little bit about them today, but in greater depth as we progress over the coming weeks, couple of months, to work our way through the steps of enabling this to happen. So some of you may have seen this diagram before. This is a slightly dated diagram. It's from the Linked Data Evolving the Web into a Global Data Space text by Tom Heath and Christian Buzar around how to do linked data. And the diagram, I think, is very, very effective. And let me talk to you about how to read it. If we look at it horizontally, up at step 1, we're looking at the range of data formats that you possibly have, well, I wouldn't say possibly, that you have your data encoded in. You may, starting on the left side of the diagram, have highly structured data. In other words, you've got a content management system that's already driving your website. That content management system has information about your credentials. It has, in structured data. As you move to the right, the data becomes less and less structured. So you may say, well, yes, on the left, we've got it in a relational database or some other form of content management system. As you move toward the end of the structured data, you say, well, we don't have a database management system, but we do have data in other forms, like tabular forms, CDSs, Excel, forms of that sort, a little less structured than the database. And then to the far right are people who say, well, we have HTML pages. We have one credential, we're one organization, and we manually manage our web page with static pages. So we run the gamut from pure text, unstructured text, over to fully structured data. And every one of you lands somewhere on that continuum. You may land at different places on that continuum for different kinds of data. And that's one thing that the survey tries to ferret out. But all of you land somewhere there. So that's the horizontal axis. The vertical axis, steps 1 through step 4, are going to be the process steps that we go through with this exercise we're entering into now. The first one at the top is the survey. From the survey, we will begin through steps 2 down through 4 to look at how you can take that data that you have in structured or unstructured forms and actually transform it so that by the time, not transform it, map it out to the form, to the CTDL, so that by the time we're down to step 4 and 4B, all of you are able to express your credentials using CTDL, and they're sitting there waiting to either be pushed to the credential registry or pulled to the credential registry by the registry itself. So the vertical is sort of a process outline and maps out the steps we will take over the next several months as we work our way through how to document these for each of these vertical silos. So, for example, the guidelines for what to do if your data is basically unstructured text. Here there would be a vertical that would be a guideline for that. And so you can just consider the verticals. There are here 4 verticals, and get that our goal is to develop guidelines so we can take people with that kind of data through the process and then all end up in the same place when we get down to 4A, 4B, or 4B. We're ready to publish to the registry. So that's the general structure of the diagram itself. And let's see. As you'll notice that it ranges then in many cases from manual processes over with the text to highly automated processes on the far left. I'm sorry, on the far right, highly manual. On the far left, highly automated. The goal, even with those that are manual at the top at step 1, by the time we get down to step 4, it's possible to put in place mechanisms that can automate the process even on the text side that's working fairly manually. So the goal is to be able to make it possible for you to generate, how to phrase this, you may have 1 credential, you may have hundreds. And if you follow the solution stack for any of the 4, you should in the end be able to automate the generation of that 1 or the generation of all 4. If you modify the 1, you should be able to reflect that automatically out into a CTDL version. So the whole goal as we move down through it is to more and more automate the process so that there is nothing in the end for people to do. Building off of the underlying data, it generates the CTDL representation. The representation can either be pushed or pulled. So that's the general structure. So the goal in the end, then, when we get to step 4, is that we have all of these descriptions encoded in CTDL in a way that can be consumed by the registry. We've taken all of the variant in your original data and in the end come up with unified structures around description of the credentials, description of you as an organization, description of competency frameworks that you're used with your credentials, and learning opportunities, which could even be courses in the context of a university. So that's the goal. So we want to take what you've got and we want to distill it down till we've expressed all of it in terms of the description language that we've developed for that purpose. So the first one, I won't talk about this a lot because Jean already covered this fairly well. The first thing we need to find out is step 1 in that diagram, at the top of the diagram, and that is what are the survey of the things, formats, and locations. I talk about things, and by things, I'm talking about credentials, competency frameworks, organizations, and I can also add here, and should, learning opportunities, courses, apprenticeships, and so forth. So there's the kinds of things you describe, the kinds of things that your data represents. And then there are the formats that we find that data in, and they can be in Word documents, PDF documents, relational databases, XML databases, tabular data like CDS and Excel files, plain HTML markup. How is that data represented? in your context. And then some other key information around organizations that are large and decentralized. I spent many years at Syracuse University and University of Washington, and I know how decentralized information flows and management are in large organizations. So we want to know all of that as much as we can from the survey so we can tailor the guidelines to meet the cases, the types of context in which you find yourself. So that's step one. Then step two is to analyze your data. So we'll do step one, and I probably should have the dates, but I don't. So at the end of step one, there'll be a period of time when people complete the survey, and then we will meet again, and we will launch into step two, which is analysis of that data. You now know where it all is. You know what it is. We now want to begin to describe in just to give you a little hint of what's coming on the next few slides, in a spreadsheet, that in which you can record what elements in your current data are used to describe organizations, and which are used to describe credentials. And so we get a sense of, if I can use this phrase, the kind of thing your system, your website is saying about your organizations. What is it saying about your credentials? So what are the fields? What are the elements? We'll want to ferret those out for each of the kinds of entities that are significant to us, organizations, credentials, and so forth. And then in the spreadsheet, record those elements per entity. So one tab of a spreadsheet, it could be organizations, the second tab, credentials, and so forth, and then one row for each of the data elements that you locally have that say name for the credential, or accredited by for the credential. What are the elements, the fields that you use to describe these? And we record them into a spreadsheet. So it would look, maybe like something like this, as simple as this. There's your element at the bottom. First off, you'll notice at the bottom there's tabs for organization, red, credential, blue, competency frameworks. So for the organization, what elements do you use to describe your organization? And you can forget about the location here, but you might want to make notes from the survey that, yeah, this is managed by central administration, this is managed by just the location of the data. And then we're going to ask you to go, okay, if your organization has a name, what is the property in CTDL to represent the name of your organization? So you'll do a crosswalk, a mapping from your elements to the elements in the CTDL, so that by the time you're finished with the spreadsheet, you'll know all of your data elements that you can, in essence, map out to create CTDL descriptions. The credential data, and we note over here, can be kind of far-ranging, and in fact, this isn't really all that are in the CTDL, but there could be data about any assessments in relationship to a credential, conditions, the conditions for entry into a credentialing program, conditions for renewal. So there's all kinds of conditions, and you can include those, costs data, employment data. There's stats on the employment status of a given credential. So employment data, verifications, quality assurance. We can go over those when we get to in more detail when we get to step two. In preparation for step two, we have a new set of pages that will be coming to the website, the technical website, very soon, that includes examples. So examples of how to use the CTDL to describe your elements. Currently, it's fairly unfriendly tables. That's going to change. We'll keep the tables, obviously, the definitional tables, but we're going to have some other help stuff that'll be in place by the time we get to this point where you're going to crosswalk your data to CTDL data. When you've completed this, you've got everything you need to then take the next steps, which is to encode that data in a machine-readable form store it, and make it available to be harvested by the CER or used by you locally. So the crosswalk is probably one of the more difficult because it's an analytic process, right? I mean, it's a process where you're looking for the semantic similarity between what you've got in your data and what CTDL has, and going, are these equivalent? So it's a semantic exercise to do that mapping. That's step 2. Then step 3, as I just said, is the serialization of it. You have a spreadsheet, but the spreadsheet isn't enough for the machine to be, your computer to be able to do much with it. So at this point, it is serialized into probably, I would assume, most likely into JSON LD, depending on the preferences of your technical folks. So that data is mapped into JSON LD and then stored. And it can be stored, if we call the diagram, in a number of ways. It can be stored as individual files. In other words, if you had one credential, you have an organization, and you have a competency framework with a number of learning outcomes or whatever, you could end up with 3 files: organization, credential, and competency framework. And you could simply park those files, literally just place them on your web server where they could be reached. And at that point, you've done your task of making them accessible so that the CR can either grab them, pull them, or you can push them yourselves to the CER. So these storage aspects match up to those that are on that band. They match up. Sorry. They match up to step 3 here, to the storage, the way you're stored. So we're not asking you to change that. Okay, I'm going to quickly jump forward again. And then step 4 is the next to the last row in that diagram, and that is, you've got this stuff stored. Now, how are you going to expose it? Some of you may elect to go, we don't want to expose any of this publicly. We want you to use it in the CER. We want it to be there. We want people to be able to link to it and do all of the linked data stuff, but we don't really care about putting this up on our website. So that sort of goes back to the question of, is this going to ask you to change something? Not necessarily. It doesn't mean you have to make this publicly available on your website in terms of viewed by people. Don't need to. So there are mechanisms, open source mechanisms, open source tools for being able to do it. For example, if you drop down to the very bottom, you see relational database. Okay, I've got it in a relational database. There is a wonderful application out there called D2R, open source, which they simply run a little server in front of your, next to your relational database, read the data out of your relational database, and present it in the right format, So there are open source ways of accomplishing that task. So 4A is to get it set. At this point, it's sitting there on your website for you to either use or just leave it there in order to populate the registry. And then the next piece and the final piece is either pushing or pulling. Pushing, you may, and here the technical team on our end will be working out mechanisms on how you can push your stuff directly to the registry, or the registry can reach out and pull. But those are the 2 mechanisms. You've got it stored, you've got it exposed where the CER can reach it, and the credential registry could simply pull the data from your website, or you could push. So those options are the 2 that would be available. So over the coming months, we're going to work our way down with the pilot partners. working collaboratively, talking to each other about how you're finding it. How are you finding this crosswalk, doing this crosswalk? What are the impediments you're finding? What could we do in guidelines that would make it easier for you to accomplish that? So we want to work in a very, very vocal, collaborative way as we move down through these steps. Some of them, after we get to step 3, really begin to involve technical folk, because they if they need in the end, or want in the end, in front of their relational database or in front of their API to the underlying data, want to bring up another application to make this life easier, it's going to involve those technical people. So steps 3 and 4 are best done within earshot of your technical people and decision makers around what will they allow you to do? Will they allow you to bring up a D2R server in order to do that automate? So those of you in large institutions, you understand the politics of all of that. So those 2 last bottom ones require that all of you do the first 2. That analytic piece is so critical. What do I have? How does what I have map to the vocabulary, to the CTDL vocabulary? And getting that as best, as right as you can, then makes it possible for technical implementation simply to read out of your data, put it into the right properties for the CTDL, and publish it. So steps 1 and 2 are analytical, but absolutely critical, because once they're correct, you should from then on be able to sit back, and when a new credential is added, the same mechanism would result in the same kind of output. So those are basically the four A and B. I guess that's almost 5 steps to achieving our goal. So, Gene, I don't know, you want to see, Roy, do I have any questions there? Gene, I'm going to hand it over to you. We got about 15 minutes.
Yeah, we have perfect timing, actually. We have just a couple of slides left to kind of wrap up, but let's just take a little pause here and see if anyone has questions for Stuart.
Well, I would also follow on with Maury's, that as the survey says, we're assuming that that all of these would be a limited number of credentials as we work through this process, a limited number. Because bear in mind, if we get it right, the number doesn't matter. If we get the process right with 3, it can write out, it could create records for 1,000, because it will have been automated in that sense. So I think our plan was that each pilot partner would have a few, looking at them and going, oh, this is a typical complex one for us. This is a typical complex, and working them through.
Okay, so we'll give everyone a moment to put some questions in the chat, and Steve has a question concerning wanting a little bit more info on use of APIs, including what they are, especially in centralized systems.
Sure, Stephen, I can't say that I am an expert here, and in fact, I think we've got people here on the call who would be much better able to talk about what an API does. But a lot of it, or its core thing, is buried in its name. It's an application. Nate, are you unmuted? API, application something interface. Is it application program interface?
Application point interface.
Point.
Can you hear me all right?
Yeah, we can. And what it does is it provides a means for external, an API is well published.
Checking endpoints.
Yeah, and covers how to query underlying data without someone from the outside actually going directly to the data, which you never want them to do. So it is a kind of a programmatic interface to your underlying data. And they're all over the place. I mean, they're all over the place. And one of the solutions is if you've already got an API that provides access to the underlying data that we are talking about, that you're mapping out, then what could be developed is a wrapper for the API, and that would be it. That would be the solution. I mean, so you would put a wrapper around the API, and what would come out on the other end would be the CTDL data. So and now that's a very unsophisticated, and don't anybody quote me that explanation, and I trust that my good colleague here, Nate, would correct me if it was way off base.
Yep. Good, perfect. I don't see any other questions coming in, but we also, I do see, I've already received some emails, and I see at least one in the chat. I think there might be others in the chat who have already indicated that they're wanting to participate, so thank you in advance.
Great.
Yeah, so, you know, we like to think of kind of working with the partners in terms of, you know, providing the service. So, you know, we don't want you to be left with the impression that you'll be figuring this out on your own. You know, we want to work together with you. We want to work to understand not only your credential information, so we've kind of covering that really well with our first part, and we've been looking at your information, what you have on the web, and as I said, manually making that match up to the CTDL. Now we need to know more about what's behind it, so you could implement it ongoing in the future. And we've said to our partners all along that we want to have these personalized roadmap documents, but we can't just pull them out of a hat. You know, we really just have to work with some partners to really understand how we can best do that, so that is useful information for all partners. So I also, just to clarify, want to say that just because, for the sake of, you know, there's only a small group of us working on this, so we have to work with a small group. But it doesn't preclude providing roadmaps to all of our partners. So in the end, that's what we want to do. We just need to be able to have a kind of doable working group that would have the ability to test out implementing these solutions. So our next step is all partners, please complete our survey. So regardless of whether or not you're thinking you could work with us directly or not, just please do. We will, of course, send you that email that I spoke of. It will include the link, and I think we'll attach a PDF of it as well, and that way it'll just be easier for you to know in advance what the questions are. And again, all this information is just critical for design. It just isn't effective for us to play a guessing game. So any information that we get is extremely useful in the outcome of wanting partners to be able to utilize these technologies. So we worked out a timeline. We try our darndest to keep our timelines as close as possible. Please know it could be subject to change. But we have worked out that we'd like the survey returned by February 9th, so that should give you some time. You know, if for some reason you have every intention of doing it, but, you know, can't get it back on time, just let us know. Then we want to notify partners as to who the, you know, smaller working group is. The next day. And then we want to begin kicking off working with the small group February 23rd. We'll set up a little workspace, and we're not saying we're going to have bukus of meetings, but we are saying we need to have some group scheduled touch bases, and then we'll do technical assistance kind of one-on-ones as needed. So this gives you an idea of the schedule here and the timeline, you know, kind of going out, projecting on really, you know, through 2017, but kind of wrapping up this little part of it end of June. Now we also have a technical advisory committee, and some of you are probably on that committee, and we'll want to do the wrap up with our technical advisory committee, so, you know, they're looped in. But then we also have these other TAC webinars in this period that any of you are welcome to participate with. So, we may have something on the agenda for these where we, talk about or mention the work that's going on and, keep them looped in. So this gives you an idea of our timeline. And my contact information is on the PowerPoint. And again, it's best to use my email just because I have a lot going on and it's hard to get on phone calls. If you need to talk, I'm more than happy to do that, but I check my email daily. The follow-up email will come from Scarlett, so you'll see that coming from her as well, and it will also include the link to our archive webinar from today in case you want others to be able to see the webinar. So let's see. I show we've got a few minutes left. Any other questions coming in here that we need to address, and any other kind of closing comments that maybe Bob or Stuart or Steve that you may have for the group?
Jeannie, this is
Jeannie, go ahead, Steve.
I just wondered if you want to say anything more about the distinction between this pilot phase and the advantages of being sort of getting in early and shaping the emerging system, because they'll be informing what we learn about how to improve it for broader use later. Anything you could add there?
Well, I think you just did. Thank you. I appreciate that. Yeah, we applaud, all the partners that have come together to help with this work. Clearly it's essential. We couldn't just do this in a vacuum, and, we appreciate those who want to be the front runners out there working with us, to your benefit, to your community's benefit, and to the benefit of all of us, or, the old adage, we're all in this together. So, yeah, thank you, Steve. And I think I heard Bob wanting to.
Yeah, I just want to reemphasize we're all really excited about the transition to Credential Engine and to scaling this initiative, and that's why this feedback loop is so important between now and June 20th, and that's the timing of it, because we've learned so much from our pilot partners, as Jeannie has said, and that we want to continue that way of doing work so that we are continuing working, again, with the editor for the individual pilots. We're adding pilots pretty much almost daily, at least weekly. We're adding more and more pilot partners, and now we want to get 6 to 10 of our pilot partners who have been so instrumental in helping us think through how to approach this to now help us help evaluate these guidelines. So at the end of June, we can start now more moving to scale. But it's only going to be possible by getting 6 to 10 of you all to really help us in co-engineering the guidelines to make sure they're robust enough to address the full spectrum of players in the space and where they are now. And so it's their own situations and needs we have to make sure of. So again, we're excited to move to the Credential Engine next stage. And I want to thank you all so much for what you contributed up to now, and we encourage you all to consider participation in the 6 to 10 because of the importance of our pilot partners in helping us think through an approach that works.
Right. Well, thank you. Thank you for that, Bob. And we've got a few minutes to spare, so we'll just let everyone go earlier if there aren't any other questions. Thanks again. Check your email later today, and we look forward to our continued work together.